The school auditorium buzzed with chatter and sequins. Performers giggled backstage, rehearsing lines and smoothing glittered skirts. Parents leaned into conversations about dance classes and summer theater camps. And in the middle of it all, Lena sat clutching the edge of her seat like it was the last thing tethering her to earth. Her daughter, Nova, had just finished playing her original piano piece on the creaky upright that had been rolled onto the center stage. 9 years old, small for her age, with big brown eyes and a single braid hanging down her back, Nova sat on that bench like the whole world was balancing on her shoulders. She had written the song herself. Practiced every night after homework on the second-hand keyboard they'd bought from a church sale. Lena had watched her daughter grow into it, eyes closed, head tilted, fingers dancing across the keys as if pulling music straight out of the air. Tonight was supposed to be the moment it all came together. But as the final note faded into the shadows of the room, nothing followed. No applause. No polite nods. No encouragement. Just silence. And then, from somewhere behind her, a whisper, just loud enough to cut through the stillness like a razor across fabric. "She's the charity case. The one from the food pantry." The words didn't reach Lena's ears, they slammed into her spine. Her breath caught. Her hands, calloused and cracked from a week spent restocking shelves at the local grocery store, gripped the plastic chair beneath her. She didn't turn to see who had said it. She didn't have to. She knew the voice. The tone. The sting. She'd heard it too many times before. On stage, Nova bowed. Lena watched as her daughter straightened slowly, the corner of her lips pulling upward in the way they'd practiced. But when Nova's eyes swept across the crowd and met her mother's, the smile faltered. Lena nodded, barely. Just enough to say, "I see you. I'm proud. Keep standing." Nova took a single step back. Then another. She was almost off stage when it happened. A man stood up. He was seated at the very back of the auditorium, almost hidden in the shadows near the exit. Tall. Broad-shouldered. His face was unreadable from that distance, but his posture was different, confident, measured, purposeful. He began walking. Not rushed. Not dramatic. Just steady. At first, no one noticed. Then a few heads turned. A whisper cut through the confusion. "Who is that?" The judges, 3 local business owners and the high school music teacher, looked at one another in muted alarm. One leaned forward, reaching for the mic on her table, unsure if this was a disruption or a performance. Lena held her breath. She didn't know why, but something in the man's gait, how he carried himself like he belonged everywhere, kept her from moving. Nova had paused in the wings now, half hidden by the curtain, watching with eyes wide as coins. The man reached the stage and, without hesitation, turned to face the judges. "Excuse me," he said, his voice calm and even. "Would it be possible for me to speak for a moment?" The woman in the red blazer, head of the parent council, nodded, hesitantly, as if afraid to challenge whatever this was. A student rushed up and handed the man the microphone. He turned to the audience. "My name is David Hallstrom," he said. "I wasn't supposed to be here tonight. I came to pick up my nephew after his performance. But I stayed. And I'm glad I did." The room shifted. Curious now. Cautious. "I've spent the last 30 years composing music for film and theater. I've heard melodies played by world-class orchestras, sung on Broadway stages, and recorded in studios with more buttons than I know what to do with. But what I just heard..." He paused, eyes scanning the space until they landed on the edge of the curtain. "That was different." Nova peeked out. "Just a little." "Nova," he said gently. "You wrote that piece, didn't you?" A slight nod. "Then let me tell you what I heard," he continued, his voice growing warmer, stronger. "I heard the sky before a storm. I heard the ache of waiting. I heard the kind of silence most people don't know how to sit in." The audience was silent. Utterly still. That wasn't just a song. That was truth. Lena couldn't move. Couldn't blink. Her daughter, her shy, soft-voiced, second-hand dressed daughter, had just been seen. Truly seen. "I'd like to ask something," Mr. Hallstrom said. "Nova, would you mind playing it again? This time. Would you let me accompany you?" Gasps rose from the crowd like a tide. The judges looked at each other, speechless. Nova turned slowly, eyes flicking toward her mother. Lena gave the smallest nod, pressing a trembling hand to her heart. Nova stepped back onto the stage. She sat at the bench. Mr. Hallstrom joined her, careful not to crowd her space. He placed his hands above the keys but didn't play. "Not yet." He looked at her and whispered something the microphones didn't catch. She nodded. And began. This time, the melody didn't sound timid. It bloomed. And when Mr. Hallstrom joined in, his harmony didn't lead, it followed, lifting her music like wind beneath a bird's wings. The notes swelled. Grew. Filled the space that had once been tight with judgment and now stretched wide with wonder. When they finished, there was a breath of silence. Then the room erupted. Applause thundered through the auditorium. Parents stood. Students who had giggled earlier now clapped with wide-eyed awe. One judge wiped at her cheeks with a napkin from her purse. Cameras came out, flashes blinked, and Lena stood too, crying, clapping, laughing all at once. Nova looked out at the room. And smiled. Not small. Not uncertain. But bold. Proud. She bowed again. And this time, the room gave her everything. She wasn't the girl from the food pantry anymore. She was the girl who wrote the sky. Long before the night of the talent show, long before anyone stood up in the crowded auditorium or uttered the word extraordinary, Lena and Nova lived in a world where music came from leftovers. Not leftover food, though there was plenty of that, too, but leftover time, leftover energy, leftover pieces of broken dreams stitched together with the resilience only the overlooked truly understand. Lena had been raising Nova on her own since she was just over a year old. Her ex had disappeared like a season, came on strong, then vanished without warning. She didn't spend a lot of time thinking about him anymore. Life was too full of real things. Bills. Rent. Gas. Groceries. Keeping Nova's shoes dry in the winter. Making sure there were enough eggs for breakfast before school. They lived in a second-floor apartment above a laundromat. The walls were thin, the heat uneven, but Lena made it a home. The kitchen table doubled as a homework desk. The couch was second-hand, as was almost everything they owned, but Nova had once declared, "It smells like stories," and that was enough for Lena to keep it. Lena worked at the local supply store during the day, stocking shelves, managing inventory, sometimes helping customers find the right kind of screws. In the evenings, she took on shifts at a print shop downtown. It wasn't glamorous, but it kept the lights on. Most months. She did her best to keep things steady. But steadiness didn't mean ease. And then, Nova found music. It started one rainy afternoon when a neighbor left an old keyboard by the dumpster. The kind with missing knobs and faded stickers on the keys. Nova had spotted it on their way home from school and gasped like she'd discovered buried treasure. "Can we take it?" she whispered. Lena hesitated. Then shrugged. "If it still works, it's yours." That night, they sat on the floor plugging it in with a mismatched charger Lena found in their junk drawer. The keyboard blinked to life with a half-lit screen and a staticky hum. One key stuck. Another was out of tune. But to Nova, it was perfect. From that moment on, music was everywhere. She played it before dinner, after homework, sometimes in the dark with only a flashlight clutched in her elbow. She didn't play songs from the radio. She made up her own. Little progressions that Lena would hum along to while folding laundry. Sometimes Nova would say, "This one feels like flying," or "This sounds like the end of summer." She wasn't just playing notes. She was narrating emotions. At 9 years old, Lena didn't know much about music. She couldn't read sheet music or tell the difference between a major and a minor key, but she knew how to listen. And when she listened to Nova, she heard something real. Then came the flyer. Lincoln Elementary Talent Night, open to all students. Sign-up deadline, March 14th. Nova's eyes sparkled when she read it. "Do you think I could?" Lena hesitated. Nova wasn't flashy. She wasn't the kind of kid who wanted to be center stage. She didn't wear sparkles or twirl in front of mirrors. She was quiet. Thoughtful. A listener. But that day, her voice was firm. "I want to play something I wrote. Not I want to win. Not I want people to clap. Just, I want them to hear what I made." So Lena helped her sign up. Over the next few weeks, their tiny home became a rehearsal studio. The keyboard, missing one leg and propped up on milk crates, sat at the center of their living room. Lena cooked dinner to the sound of slow chords and thoughtful pauses. Sometimes Nova would stop and whisper, "Something's off," then start again from the beginning. Lena watched her daughter work, head tilted, fingers fluttering like moths over the keys, and felt something rise in her chest. Pride. Worry. Love. Mostly love. She stitched Nova's dress by hand. A lavender thing with a tiny tear at the hem she patched with invisible thread. She laid it out the night before the show alongside freshly laundered tights and the hair ties Nova liked best. She couldn't afford new shoes, but she scrubbed the ones they had until they looked nearly new. The morning of the talent show, Lena packed Nova's lunch in a paper bag with a hand-drawn star on the front and a note, "No matter what happens, I'm already proud of you." They arrived early, slipping in through the gymnasium doors while others were still unloading trumpet cases and rolling in costume racks. The auditorium was a flood of sound, parents talking over each other, teachers managing chaos, kids running in every direction. Lena sat alone near the middle, trying not to look too out of place. She wore her best jeans and a blouse that still had the faint scent of printing ink. Her hair was pulled back tight. Her hands twisted in her lap. Nova waited backstage, clutching her music folder like a shield. When they called her name, Lena's heart kicked against her ribs. Nova walked out slowly. No glitter. No fanfare. Just her and the keyboard. She adjusted the mic like they'd practiced. Sat. Breathed. And then she played. The first few notes were soft. Hesitant. But they carried. They wove themselves across the auditorium like something sacred. Lena could feel them wrapping around her ribs, pulling tears to the surface she hadn't expected. But the room didn't respond. Lena looked around, at the whispering parents, the fidgeting children, the distracted judges, and realized, with a dull thud, that no one was really listening. Not to the music. Not to the magic. And when the woman 2 rows behind her said, "She's the one from the food pantry," it wasn't a surprise. It was a confirmation of what Lena had feared. This wasn't just about a talent show. It was about being seen. And they weren't looking. But Lena looked. She always had. She saw every note Nova poured into that song. Every late-night practice. Every brave breath taken before that first chord. And even as the silence fell after the final note, even as the applause refused to come, Lena saw her daughter not as they did, but as she truly was. Brave. Brilliant. Undeniable. And something deep inside her whispered, "Just wait. This isn't the ending. Not tonight." The final note of Nova's song hung in the air like a question no one wanted to answer. She held her position at the keyboard, fingers suspended above the worn, mismatched keys, waiting for something. A clap. A nod. Even a cough of acknowledgement. Anything to tell her that someone had heard her. But all she got was stillness. And then the shuffling. The faint creak of a chair. A low whisper near the back. The scribble of a pen across a judge's clipboard. Somewhere in the crowd, a parent unwrapped a piece of gum like they were waiting in line at the bank. Lena watched her daughter's smile begin to slip, slow and soft, like the fading light at the end of a long day. Nova's eyes swept across the auditorium. She bowed, like they had practiced, her chin tucked with grace. Still nothing. And then a voice, sharp, too loud for a whisper but too smug to be hushed, cut through the air. "That's the girl from the free lunch program." Lena's breath caught. It wasn't the first time she'd heard people refer to them like that. She was used to the labels, the grocery store girl, the working mom who's always late, the one who doesn't sign up to volunteer at the bake sale because she's pulling a double shift. But to hear it directed at her daughter, in this moment? It burned. Deep. She wanted to scream, "She's more than that." She wanted to stand up, march up to the stage, and wrap Nova in her arms and carry her out of that room forever. But she didn't. Her legs refused to move. Her voice died in her throat. The heat of shame, not from anything she had done, but from being seen as less than, again, pulsed through her skin. Nova stepped off the stage slowly, her small black flats making the lightest sound against the wooden floor. She held her music folder close to her chest like armor. She wasn't crying. But she wasn't okay, either. Lena could see it in the way her shoulders curled in, trying to make herself smaller. In the way her head stayed lowered, not from humility, but from the weight of invisible judgment pressing down from all sides. And still, no one clapped. Not even out of pity. The MC fumbled for the microphone, calling out the next act, a tumbling trio in sparkly leotards. They burst onto the stage in a flurry of rhinestones and forced smiles, as if Nova's performance had never happened. The crowd stirred, excited again. Ready for movement. Ready to be entertained. Lena couldn't move. Couldn't breathe. She sat in her chair, chest tight, vision blurry, watching her daughter vanish behind the velvet curtain. That's when it happened. It was small at first. Subtle. A shuffle near the back row. Then footsteps. Slow. Intentional. A man stood. Lena blinked, thinking maybe she imagined it. He was tall. Dressed in a plain gray suit. No phone in his hand. No program. Just presence. He began walking down the aisle. At first, no one noticed. But soon, heads turned. A father leaned over to his wife, whispering. One of the judges lowered her clipboard. The girl backstage, next in line, peeked from behind the curtain, eyes wide. The man didn't hurry. He walked like someone who didn't need to explain himself. When he reached the front of the auditorium, he turned to the judging table. "Excuse me," he said, voice calm but full. "Would it be all right if I address the room?" A murmur rose like a tide. The head judge, a music teacher from the high school, hesitated, then nodded once, slowly. The student assistant handed him the microphone. The man stepped up to center stage. The MC looked stunned. Lena's heart pounded in her chest like a trap drum beat. "I wasn't supposed to be here tonight," the man began, his voice clear, confident. "My name is Conrad Blackwell. I'm a retired conductor from the Eastbrook Chamber Ensemble, and I've spent most of my life listening to music. But tonight, I heard something I haven't heard in a very long time." The room quieted again, but this time, it was different. This silence was not from indifference. It was attention. "Nova," he said gently, turning toward the edge of the curtain. "May I ask, did you compose that piece yourself?" A tiny nod from the wings. Conrad smiled, just slightly. "Then what you did tonight was more than a performance. It was a conversation. And I, for one, would very much like to hear it again." The audience stirred. Whispers rose like wind through leaves. Then he turned back to the judges. "With your permission, I'd like to accompany her. Just to hear it again. With everyone listening this time." One of the judges dropped her pen. The music teacher's eyes flicked between his colleagues, then to the audience, and finally back to Conrad. He nodded. Lena felt her breath leave her in a rush. Nova stepped out again. Still clutching her folder. Still quiet. But something had shifted. She looked not just at the crowd, but through them. She sat back at the keyboard. Conrad took the bench beside her but didn't touch the keys. "Your tempo, your lead," he whispered. "I'm just the echo." Nova gave a slow breath, glanced once at her mother, then placed her hands on the keys. And began. The first few notes from Nova's fingers were the same, soft, searching, careful as footsteps in a forest. But this time, they didn't float into a vacuum. They landed. Conrad Blackwell's hands hovered just above the piano, listening, waiting. When Nova reached the third measure, where the melody fluttered like wings trying to remember how to fly, he joined her. Not loudly. Not to lead. Just enough to lift. His chords fell beneath her notes like a breeze catching a kite. Their harmony wasn't rehearsed, wasn't polished, but it didn't need to be. It was instinct. Response. A kind of musical conversation that unfolded in real time, one line at a time. The audience, once restless, stilled completely. Phones that had been used to scroll were now filming. Parents who looked through her before now leaned forward in their seats. Even the MC at the side of the stage stood slack-jawed, mic hanging useless in his hand. Lena sat in the center of it all, unmoving, tears slipping down her cheeks without shame. She didn't even wipe them away. For once, she wasn't afraid to be seen crying. Because they were finally listening. Nova's shoulders were straighter now. Her hands more certain. She played not just with skill, but with conviction, as if she finally believed she deserved to be heard. That her voice, her song, mattered. The piece was no longer a whisper into a storm. It had become a declaration. Conrad added only where needed. A chord to fill a hollow. A low echo that deepened the sadness. A harmonic bend that turned a quiet question into a hopeful answer. The music wasn't flashy. It wasn't what anyone had come expecting. But it stopped the room. When the final note came, delicate, unresolved, as Nova had written it, it didn't fall into silence. It fell into awe. There was a heartbeat's pause, the kind that always comes before an ovation, the breath before the roar. And then they stood. All of them. The entire auditorium erupted. Applause. Whistles. Cheers. Not the scattered, polite clapping handed out like consolation prizes. This was something else. This was thunder. Nova blinked, startled by the sound. For a second, she looked like she might flinch. But then Conrad leaned toward her and whispered something only she could hear. She nodded. And smiled. It was the smallest smile. But it reached all the way to Lena's chest, splitting it wide open. Nova turned to face the crowd, hands still on her lap. She bowed again, but not like before. Not tentative. Not unsure. She bowed like she owned the moment. When she rose, her chin was high. Her eyes sparkled, not with tears, but with light. Her whole being radiated something Lena hadn't seen in a long time. Pride. Not arrogance. Not ego. Just the quiet, blazing certainty of someone who finally knew their voice had power. Conrad stood beside her, clapped once with the crowd, then stepped back, letting her have the moment. And the room, this room that had once dismissed her as the poor girl, now looked at her as something else entirely. A talent. A revelation. A child who had just rewritten her own story in front of them. As she walked off stage, the applause continued. Parents turned to each other, asking her name. Children backstage stared like they'd seen a magic trick. One judge was openly wiping her eyes, mascara streaking quietly down her cheek. Lena stood as Nova walked toward her, head high, steps strong. The girl who had bowed to silence was walking through thunder. When Nova reached her, she didn't say anything at first. She just wrapped her arms around her mother and pressed her face into her chest. "I did it," she whispered, breath hitching. "You did," Lena replied, her voice a soft tremble. "They hurt you. They really hurt me." "Yes," Lena said, pressing a kiss to her daughter's hair. "And now they'll never forget." Conrad approached them a moment later. He extended a hand toward Lena, but before she could take it, he looked at Nova. "You didn't just play," he said. "You spoke. And the world needs more of that." Nova bit her lip, unsure how to respond. "You gave me something rare tonight," he continued, looking between the two of them. "May I give something back?" He reached into his pocket and pulled out a silver card, simple, embossed with his name and a New York address. "I help mentor young composers," he said. "And I know a foundation that offers private mentorships, no auditions, just raw talent. If you're open to it, I'd like to recommend Nova for one of their weekend intensives. It won't cost anything. All she has to do is keep writing." Lena's hand trembled as she took the card. She's never had formal training. We don't really have." "You don't need to," Conrad said. "This isn't about privilege. It's about promise. And your daughter, she has it in spades." Nova looked up at her mom, eyes wide, asking permission without words. Lena nodded, voice caught in her throat. "Say thank you, baby." "Thank you," Nova said, soft but certain. Conrad smiled. "You're welcome. Keep playing. Keep telling the truth." He walked back toward the crowd, disappearing into the sea of new fans and humbled onlookers. And as the buzz of voices filled the room again, Lena held the card to her chest and closed her eyes for a moment. The world hadn't changed overnight. But her daughter's future just had. It's been 5 months since Nova stepped onto that stage and played her heart out, first into silence, and then into a standing ovation. 5 months since the moment a man in a gray suit reminded an entire room how powerful it is to truly listen. From the outside, not much has changed. Lena still wakes up before sunrise to make breakfast and catch the early bus to the supply store. She still works weekends at the print shop, sometimes coming home with aching feet and ink smudges on her fingers. Their second-floor apartment above the laundromat still hums with the rattle of dryers and the occasional whiff of detergent in the hallway. Nova still wears hand-me-down shoes. Her backpack is the same faded blue one from last year, patched at the corner with duct tape and stickers from a cereal box. They still budget carefully, stretch meals creatively, and say no to a lot of extras. But inside their world? Everything's different. Now, every Saturday morning, Lena and Nova wake up before the sun rises and pack a small thermos of cocoa, a peanut butter sandwich, and a plastic folder filled with music sheets. They drive an hour and a half to the city, where Nova attends a weekend mentorship program hosted by the Youth Arts Foundation Mr. Conrad Blackwell connected them with. It's held in a sprawling old conservatory that smells like wood polish and stories. The halls echo with piano scales, violin tuning, and the soft thud of jazz bass behind closed doors. Nova walks those halls like she was born to belong there, not with swagger, but with quiet assurance. Her instructors say she writes with depth beyond her age. That her melodies hint at memories and meanings they can't always explain but always feel. One of them called her work narrative music, the kind that doesn't just sound pretty, it says something. She still plays the piece she performed that night. The one she once bowed to in silence. But now, when she plays it, there's something new in her hands. Not volume. Not flash. Weight. Confidence. She doesn't just play like someone who hopes to be heard. She plays like someone who knows she has something to say. And Lena? Something changed in her, too. She used to move through the world with her shoulders tucked, her chin lowered. Not from shame, but from fatigue, from years of being quietly passed over, underestimated, and labeled. But now, she walks differently. Still tired. Still stretched. But taller. Because she saw something most parents only dream of. Her daughter finding her voice, and being received by the world not with ridicule, but with respect. Lena thinks about that night often. Not just the performance. Not just the applause. But the moment, the second when Nova had finished her song and the world stayed silent. The moment Lena almost let her daughter believe that silence meant she wasn't good enough. That she wasn't seen. And how one man, just one, chose not to let that happen. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't even planned. It was a decision. A decision to stand. A decision to say, I hear you. And that changed everything. Lena keeps Conrad's card tucked into a small frame on the shelf now. Not because of what it offered, but because of what it meant. That someone saw past the patched shoes and paper lunch bags. That someone recognized the symphony inside a girl who had been told, in a dozen small ways, that her voice didn't matter. She didn't need to be saved. She needed to be seen. And now, Nova sees herself differently, too. She no longer sits at the keyboard wondering if she's enough. She sits at the keyboard knowing she is. Sometimes at night, Lena peeks into Nova's room to find her hunched over her old keyboard, the one missing 2 keys and patched with duct tape. She still uses it, even though the conservatory offered her a newer one. I like this one, she said. It remembers my first song. Lena sits beside her sometimes, sipping tea, just listening. No longer wondering if anyone else is paying attention. Because Nova's not playing to impress anymore. She's playing to tell the truth. And Lena knows now, truth doesn't always get applause the first time. Sometimes, the world needs a moment to catch up. Sometimes, the silence isn't rejection. It's the breath before the shift. The pause before the rise. The echo that builds into something unforgettable. And so, they keep going. Not with guarantees. But with rhythm. With purpose. With sound. Because when the world finally hears your song, you don't stop playing. You play louder. You play clearer. You play for the ones still waiting in the wings, holding their music close, wondering if it matters. It does. And one day, someone will hear it. Just like they heard Nova.